The following program is intended for listeners who are blind, have low vision, or have another print disability which makes reading, holding a book, or turning a page difficult or impossible. The content is copyrighted by the respective publishers. For more information, please visit us on the web at nfradioreading.org.
Hello, this is Dasha, and for the next hour I'll be reading from the December 5th, Friday issue of the Wall Street Journal on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. On the front page, among other things, the president shortens migrant work permits. Renewals required after 18 months instead of 5 years, reversing a Biden rule by Michelle Hackman. Work permits issued to immigrants who have applied for asylum or a range of other humanitarian programs will now be valid for 18 months rather than 5 years, under a new policy announced on Thursday by the Trump administration. By forcing immigrants to renew their work permits more often, the government will have more opportunities to revet them, said Joe Edlow, Director of U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, the agency that handles most legal immigration applications. Edlow framed the change, which reverses a Biden-era policy, as the latest action by the administration to crack down on legal immigration in response to the shooting last week in Washington, D.C., of 2 National Guard members. Federal officials allege the shooting was carried out by an Afghan national. It's clear that the USCIS must enforce more frequent vetting of aliens, Edlow said. All aliens must remember that working in the United States is a privilege, not a right. In the past week, President Trump has called for a broad reverse migration of legal immigrants in the U.S., including from countries such as Afghanistan. A day after the shooting, Trump posted to his Truth Social platform that he planned to permanently pause migration from all third world countries. And his administration is working on expanding the list of countries subject to a travel ban. The shortened expiration dates for work permits will primarily affect immigrants seeking asylum or other forms of humanitarian protections, including refugees, immigrants who have won their asylum cases, or who have another form of deportation relief, known as withholding of removal. The policy was expected to go into effect on Thursday and only apply to new work permits for now. The change likely will impact hundreds of thousands of people. For example, to staff their plants, meatpacking companies have relied on people who received legal work authorizations after applying for asylum in the U.S. The shorter work permits will likely deter asylum seekers from coming to the U.S., potentially worsening labor shortages for senior care, said Rob Liebrich, CEO and president of Goodwin Living, an owner and operator of senior living communities and other healthcare services in Northern Virginia and Washington, D.C. About 4% of the nonprofit's roughly 1,500 employees are seeking a green card or U.S. citizenship, and most of those staff are asylum seekers and refugees, he said. Not having a strong labor force is really difficult, he said, adding that he could already use more nurses, cooks, and housekeepers. An even smaller pool of potential workers could raise the prices for care, especially as the older adult population in the U.S. grows, he said. There's a huge reality that we need more hands, more trained hands. Most work visa categories, such as the H-1B, don't require a separate work permit. The Trump administration's change is likely to raise concerns among immigrant advocates and employers, especially in industries that tend to hire refugees or asylum seekers. Citizenship and Immigration Services has long been stretched thin amid ever-growing legal immigration backlogs. Meanwhile, the administration has announced other initiatives to reopen old immigration cases for re-vetting, which will divert more immigration officers from reviewing new applications. The Biden administration initially extended the expiration dates on work permits to 5 years from 2 in 2023. At the time, faced with an influx of asylum applicants from the southern border, the government had so many work permits to process that it couldn't issue renewals before people's existing permits expired. As a result, tens of thousands of immigrants were laid off or temporarily furloughed while their work authorizations lapsed, including many working in more traditionally high-paying industries, such as tech or finance. The Biden-era policy presented trade-offs. The longer expiration dates offered immigrants and their employers peace of mind that work was less likely to be interrupted. But it also created new complications. With longer expiration dates, companies were more likely to face a scenario in which their employees held valid work permit documents but weren't authorized to work anymore because they had lost their asylum or other immigration cases. Shortening the validity period of work permits is bad for everyone, said Conchita Cruz, co-executive director of the Asylum Seeker Advocacy Program, a membership organization of asylum seekers. With shorter validity periods, work permit processing backlogs will grow longer and force asylum seekers out of the workforce, hurting their employers, their co-workers, and the communities that rely on them throughout the U.S. There's a large photograph of, on page A2, of the RoboCop. Detroit icon finds a home. A RoboCop statue looming 11 feet tall and weighing 3,500 pounds had its debut this week after a 15-year campaign to pay homage to the 1987 sci-fi movie set in a violent, futuristic Detroit. There was a time when the city pushed back on anything pointing to its past reputation as an unsafe city, but violent crime has dropped below mid-1960s levels, and city officials didn't object. A Kickstarter campaign raised $67,000, but the pandemic and trouble finding a home for the statue delayed the project for years. This is an Associated Press story with a picture of the statue, which stands taller than the first story of a brick building behind it. U.S. News: The World Has More Billionaires Than Ever by Juliet Chung. The total number of billionaires across the globe reached new heights in 2025, due partly to the soaring valuations of tech companies and rising share prices, according to a new study by Swiss banking giant UBS. Some 2,900 billionaires now control $15.8 trillion, up from about 2,700 billionaires with a cumulative wealth of nearly $14 trillion a year earlier. The number and wealth of billionaires as a whole were boosted by the second highest number of new billionaires minted in a year, 287, since UBS began tracking that figure in 2015. Only 2021, with its flood of government stimulus and low interest rates that boosted the prices of assets, saw a higher number of new billionaires created. You've seen this acceleration of billionaire growth, and it's actually coming from all areas, said John Matthews, UBS's head of private wealth management in the U.S., referring to the creation of new billionaires from both entrepreneurship and inheritance. Also boosting wealth, rising investment gains over the 12 months ended April 4th, 2025, the period covered by the study. The stock market rout around President Trump's so-called Liberation Day tariff announcement damped returns for the period, though the market has largely continued churning upwards since. The new self-made billionaires created in 2025 were entrepreneurs in a range of fields. According to UBS, they include Ben Lamb, founder of Colossal Biosciences, Michael Durrell, co-founder of the infrastructure investment firm Stone Peak Partners, the Zhang brothers of Mixu Ice Cream and Tea in China, and crypto billionaire Justin Sun. 91 of the new billionaires inherited their wealth, including 15 members of 2 pharmaceutical families in Germany. We've been talking about the great wealth transfer now for over a decade, and you're starting to see it come to fruition, Matthews said. I'd say we're in the second inning of a 9-inning baseball game. He said much of the wealth would first pass to surviving partners, typically wives, before passing on to the next generation. A recent analysis by Altrata, a wealth intelligence firm, similarly showed growth in the number of billionaires around the world to record levels. Altrata estimated 3,508 individuals held $13.4 trillion in total wealth, and said about a third were in the U.S. China came in second, with 321 billionaires holding about 10% of the world's wealth. The UBS report includes information from a database maintained by UBS and PricewaterhouseCoopers that looks at billionaire wealth globally. UBS also interviewed 87 billionaire clients for its 11th annual Billionaire Ambitions Report and found that the appeal of North America as the best place to invest in the short term had decreased to 63% from 81% a year earlier. The appeal of investing in other regions, Western Europe, Greater China, and Asia Pacific, excluding Greater China, were picked up. While Asian billionaires' top worry for the next year was tariffs, a majority of U.S. billionaires were most concerned about inflation or geopolitics, according to the study. Unemployment claims have fallen. Newly filed unemployment claims last week dropped to the lowest level in 3 years, the Labor Department said, a reassuring signal that the economy avoided a big surge of layoffs through the first 11 months of the year. About 191,000 Americans filed for new unemployment benefits in the week through November 29th, a drop from 218,000 a week earlier and the fewest since September 2022. Economists had anticipated 220,000 new claims. Continuing claims, which track the total size of the unemployed population, were 1.94 million in the week through November 22nd, down slightly from a week earlier. Those data lag behind the initial claims numbers by a week. The continuing claims tally has moved higher this year, a sign of slower hiring that has prolonged job searches. The weekly claims reports have been an optimistic sign amid a broader patchwork of uneven labor market data. The average monthly pace of hiring has slowed, and unemployment has gradually edged higher in the past several months, raising concerns that the employment picture has turned more fragile than it was earlier in the 2020s. That's by Matt Grossman. The Wall Street Journal staff writes that the layoff tally nears 1.2 million. Companies announced more than 71,300 planned job cuts last month, Challenger, Gray, and Crispus said. That was a sharp 54% drop from a month earlier when the consulting firm's last report showed a spike in layoffs. That caused a stir amid an official data vacuum. But the figure was up from a year earlier and high for November, usually a quiet month for firing plans. In January through November, companies have laid out plans to cut 1.17 million positions. That's the highest year-to-date level since 2020. And also by Matt Grossman, factory orders have increased 0.2%. Orders from U.S. factories rose by 0.2% in September, the Census Bureau said Thursday. The report, delayed by government shutdown, showed that the U.S. manufacturers received new orders totaling $612.6 billion in September versus $611.5 billion in August. Government statistics agencies are still catching up from the 6-week spending impasse that sidelined federal workers in October and November. Shipments from factories were roughly flat, month over month, in September, while unfilled orders rose by 0.7%, the 14th monthly increase in the past 15 months. Inventories decreased by 0.1% in September. An Illinois steel plant is to resume production, by Bob Tita. U.S. Steel plans to resume steelmaking at an Illinois plant where the Trump administration intervened last summer to keep production going. The company stopped making steel at Granite City Works 2 years ago and had planned to further curtail operations before the administration blocked the move in September. It said it now sees signs of rising demand that justify restarting one of Granite City's 2 blast furnaces early next year to produce molten iron for steel. U.S. Steel also is expected to need the mill's steelmaking capacity, as some of its other mills undergo improvements promised by Nippon Steel, the new owner of U.S. Steel. We are confident in our ability to safely and profitably operate the mill to meet 2026 demand, said U.S. Steel Chief Executive David Burritt. The company expects to add about 400 employees at Granite City to operate the blast furnace, raising the plant's workforce to about 1,200, a person familiar with the matter said. The decision to restart the furnace wasn't influenced by the Trump administration, the person said. Steel demand has been weak for much of the past 2 years, reflecting struggles in the manufacturing and construction sectors. Lead times for filling steel orders at American mills have lengthened recently, indicating more orders for the metal. The Granite City furnace restart comes as Nippon Steel is beginning $11 billion worth of improvements at existing U.S. steel plants. Nippon Steel completed its $14.1 billion acquisition of U.S. Steel in June, after striking a deal with the Trump administration that committed the Tokyo-based steelmaker to the investments and other pledges. Nippon Steel also granted President Trump and future U.S. presidents so-called Golden Chair authority over plant closings, the transfer of production work out of the country, and other operational changes at U.S. Steel. The Trump administration invoked that authority in September after U.S. Steel notified about 800 workers at the Granite City plant it planned to stop rolling slabs of steel from other plants into sheet steel. U.S. Steel said it intended to continue paying the employees into 2027, even without regular work at the plant. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the Wall Street Journal on the Niagara Frontier radio reading service. The New York Times sues Hegseth over new press rules by Alexandra Bruel. The New York Times and its intelligence reporter Julian E. Barnes have sued the Trump administration, saying the Defense Department's new press rules violate their free speech and due process rights. The lawsuit names as defendants the Defense Department, as well as Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth and Pentagon spokesman Sean Parnell. It says the policies enacted earlier this fall are unreasonable and chill protected speech that department officials might not like. The Pentagon issued a memo in September stating that reporters would need to sign a document restricting their communication with military sources. Many outlets interpreted it as requiring that they agree not to disclose classified or other sensitive information without prior authorization. The guidelines were revised in subsequent weeks, but major media organizations balked at the final version in October. The Times, The Washington Post, The Wall Street Journal, Fox News, CNN, and others declined to sign on to the new Defense Department policy. Publishers and broadcasters that didn't sign the policy lost regular press access to the headquarters building and had to clear out their workspaces. Another group of media representatives, including conservative influencer Laura Loomer and former Republican Congressman and One America News Network host Matt Gaetz, have since been granted press credentials and attended a briefing this week. The Times said Thursday that the policy punished news gathering journalists reporting on the U.S. military face loss of their press credentials for doing nothing more than bringing facts to light on behalf of the public, one of the core tenets of the free press in a democracy, the company said in a press release announcing its lawsuit, which it filed in the U.S. District Court for the District of Columbia. Barnes, who's been with the Washington Bureau of the Times since 2018, writes about national security and military intelligence. He previously worked for the Journal. The Times asks for a judge to declare the new policy unconstitutional and issue an injunction barring its enforcement, and that the Pentagon reinstate press credentials for Barnes and other Times reporters. We are aware of the New York Times lawsuit and look forward to addressing these arguments in court, Parnell said. Parnell posted on X in October that access to the building, quote, is a privilege, not a right, and the department is not only legally permitted, but morally obligated to impose reasonable regulations on the exercise of that privilege, end quote. For decades, reporters wearing identification badges had wide-ranging access to non-classified areas of the Pentagon. The Trump administration has upended long-standing press traditions, including determining which outlets are part of the press pool and limiting access to certain parts of the West Wing, where senior communications staff typically work. Earlier this year, the Defense Department removed dedicated Pentagon office space for outlets, including the Times, NBC News, The Hill, and CNN, giving the spots instead to the New York Post, One America News Network, Breitbart News Network, HuffPost News, and others in what they call a new rotation program. The administration has also recently launched a new official White House webpage criticizing individual journalists and news outlets for what it calls, quote, false and misleading coverage. Short news bits in U.S. Watch. From Florida, redistricting effort begins in-house. Florida's Republican-controlled House officially kicked off the first meeting of its Select Committee on Congressional Redistricting Thursday, as the state becomes the latest to consider redrawing electoral maps amid a partisan battle for every edge in next year's midterm elections. But the prospect of mid-decade redistricting in President Trump's adopted home state remains uncertain, with the top Republican on the committee stopping short of committing to draft new maps and appearing to draw a deeper divide among his party's leaders on how the process should move forward. Republican State Representative Mike Redondo, who chairs the committee, cemented his chamber's commitment to consider redistricting during Florida's regular session, which runs from January 13 to March 13, saying it would be irresponsible to wait until next spring, as the GOP-controlled state Senate and Republican Governor Ron DeSantis have called for. The push for redistricting faces major challenges in Florida because of bitter infighting between DeSantis and leaders in the GOP-dominated legislature, along with a provision in the state constitution that explicitly bars redrawing maps with the intent to favor or disfavor a political party or an incumbent. Florida currently has 28 congressional seats, with a Republican-Democratic split of 20-8. We're going to press this issue, DeSantis said in August. That's from Associated Press. Also from Associated Press, in Washington, racial bias has been alleged in agency firings. 2 black men who were fired by President Trump from the National Transportation Safety Board and U.S. Surface Transportation Board accused the administration on Thursday of discriminating against them as part of a pattern of dismissing black leaders across the government. Robert Primus on the STB and Alvin Brown on the NTSB were the only black board members overseeing their officially independent agencies when they were fired this year. Both had already filed lawsuits challenging their dismissals, saying the White House didn't have good cause, as the law requires. Democracy Forward filed the new discrimination claims on behalf of both men. When you look at who has been removed without cause and who has been left in place, the pattern is impossible to ignore. Black commissioners across the federal government have been summarily fired, said Brown, who was vice chairman of the NTSB. My abrupt removal was unlawful and it was discriminatory. The White House didn't respond to the new legal filing, but has said Trump was well within his legal rights to fire Primus and Brown. The administration hasn't filed a formal response to Primus's lawsuit, but the Trump administration asked a judge to dismiss Brown's lawsuit. On the opinion page, we have Potomac Watch by Kimberly A. Strassel. The lesson of Minnesota's fraud. Republicans in recent years were handed the gift of California, that collapsing paragon of climate virtue, an excellent argument for the GOP's own better energy agenda. Their Christmas present this year is Minnesota, if the party has the wits to seize on the moral of that state's epic fraud story. America's welfare system is irredeemably broken. The Minnesota story, in which Somali fraudsters bilked taxpayers out of more than $1 billion, has many ugly storylines to choose from. It's a parable of failed assimilation and the need for policies that heat the melting pot. It's another warning of identity politics, of fraudsters using minority-owned status to cash in and crying racism to evade scrutiny. It's a scandal of politicians who look the other way, more eager to win votes than to enforce the law. President Trump has, for his part, sought to co-opt the story for his own priority, immigration. He's raged about the ungrateful Somali immigrants, paused immigration applications from 19 countries, and ramped up immigration enforcement operations in the Minneapolis area. This might excite the base, but it's diverting attention from a far better policy opportunity. Because at root, this is a story of broken welfare, of a federal government that shovels more than $1 trillion annually into more than 80 major anti-poverty programs and countless minor ones, a system too complex to ensure even basic integrity, and of a state that preened as a model of social welfare, its own lavish spending benefits, drawing many immigrants and inviting a plundering. The U.S. welfare debate has long centered on the failed outcomes of overly generous government programs, the long-term dependency and loss of dignity, the discouragement of work, the damage to family structure. We've had many rounds of this discussion, from fallout over the New Deal and Great Society to welfare queens in the 1990s. Today's vast outlays and falling labor force participation rates are proof that the failure is becoming deeper. According to the Center for Immigration Studies, the share of U.S.-born working-age men not in the labor force was about 11% in 1960. It is now 22%. But Minnesota raises to alarm level a separate need for reset. The system itself, the government machine, is broken. Its heaving, duplicative federal-state programs, awash in forms and bureaucracies and ancient mainframes, has already suffered Soviet-style collapse. The system serves more as a cash machine for criminals than a safety net for the needy. How do you separate the wheat from the slime amid millions of overlapping self-attested, yes, we still work on the honor system, applications for SNAP, WIC, unemployment insurance, EITC, LI-HEAP, CHIP, TANF, Medicaid, Head Start, Pell Grants, public housing, rental assistance, legal services, adoption subsidies, and adult education, overlaid with hundreds of state-level counterparts? You don't. You write checks. And the crooks now know it. As Joe Thompson, lead prosecutor in the big Minnesota cases, said, "This isn't just a few criminals exploiting the system. This is a system that's been begging to be exploited." We'd already been told this. Even the government auditors, numb to fraud, were bug-eyed at the scams that sucked through Joe Biden's, your COVID dollars. Elon Musk's Department of Government Efficiency told us again of babies cadging small business loans and long-dead citizens collecting Social Security. Minnesota is the new outrage, useful both for the extravagant outrage of the theft, Somalis siphoning taxpayer dollars for luxury cars and homes, and because it's Minnesota. Democrats long pitched the state as a model of a successful, generous, Swedish-style social welfare, financed by high taxes, much as California pitched itself as the future of green energy. How's that going? This is a moment. Republicans might be shouting from the rooftops that Minnesota proves how right they were to have included in their tax reform bill the slate of anti-fraud reforms to Medicaid and food stamps, but they might also seize on this scandal to take the fraud argument much further, to explain that this is no longer a situation that can be corrected with more due diligence. It's the size and scope of the morass that is enabling fraud. The argument? We need to move many people off government dependency, not just for moral and societal reasons, but because government has an obligation to taxpayers and the truly needy to right-size and return to a system that can function, one that's lean, efficient, and able to focus its dollars on the actual mission, temporary assistance. In a perfect world, we'd tear down the maze we've added to for a century and replace it with a central clearinghouse for short-term government support, able to interact efficiently with the states. Why not reimagine government? All around us is evidence that current structure is failing and past the date of fixing. Americans know it and will reward a party that admits it and offers a reset. You're listening to a reading of articles and features from the Wall Street Journal on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Also on the opinion pages, Bad Ukraine Deal Could Spur Nuclear Proliferation by Casey Michelle. As the Trump administration renews its search for peace in Ukraine, much of the commentary has centered on what Kyiv would have to give up in a peace deal. Far less attention has been paid to the global implications of the U.S. proposal, specifically how it would create an incentive for nuclear proliferation. Even without a deal in place, the administration's latest push is apt to accelerate conversations non-nuclear states are already having about whether to trust America's nuclear umbrella. The pressure on Ukraine to cede much of its territory will embolden non-nuclear states to consider developing their own nuclear arsenals. It was the U.S. that strong-armed Ukraine into giving up its nuclear weapons in the 1990s. Ukraine did so in exchange for U.S. security assurances that have since fallen apart. In 2014, Russia invaded Crimea. President Barack Obama rolled over, which emboldened Russia to try for more later on. Like President Trump, Mr. Obama wanted to rid the world of nuclear weapons. Instead, he set the stage for what may be the biggest proliferation of nuclear weapons in decades. This history speaks to why U.S. interests in Ukraine go beyond the territorial integrity of one country. American involvement never hinged on the fate of the Donbass, but on whether an expansionist nuclear power could hack apart a non-nuclear neighbor, and how the U.S. would respond if it did. Unsurprisingly, Ukraine has seen an upsurge in domestic support for developing its own nuclear capabilities in the past few years. Around the world, any number of U.S. allies are also questioning their non-nuclear status. The conversation has been most pronounced in East Asia, where U.S. allies have watched as the Chinese Communist Party swallowed Tibet and Hong Kong, and now has its sights set on Taiwan. Given the parallels with Ukraine and Russia, South Korea and Japan are considering whether they should have their own nuclear arsenals. Ross Anderson reports in The Atlantic that almost everyone he asked about the subject on a trip to South Korea mentioned Ukraine. Australia has likewise seen a swell of questions about America's reliability and whether Canberra should have its own nuclear weapons. So has Canada, which even has to consider potential American expansionism. Kazakhstan, which, like Ukraine, gave up its Soviet nuclear weapons after the Cold War, could also be primed for a return to nuclear status. Kazakhstan is vulnerable to Russian aggression in all the ways Ukraine is. It shares a long, contested border with Russia. It faces continuing revanchism from the Russian nationalists, and its government is increasingly independent of Moscow. Given that Kazakhstan also made an agreement with the U.S. to rid itself of nuclear weapons, and that it maintains one of the largest stockpiles of weapons-grade plutonium in the world among non-nuclear states, it would be surprising if Kazakhstan didn't consider relaunching its nuclear program. In Europe, long-dormant debates about nuclear posture have emerged in Germany and Poland. The latter is especially unsurprising, not only because of Warsaw's experience with Russian imperialism, but because the move to bring Poland into the North Atlantic Treaty Organization in the 1990s was done partially as a means of staving off a Polish nuclear weapons program. As one American official remembered, Polish officials told Washington, "If you don't let us into NATO, we're getting nuclear weapons. We don't trust the Russians." Poland was right not to trust the Russians. But with America's sudden push for Ukraine to cede territory in return for insecure peace, there are now questions about whether they should trust the Americans, or whether the only thing they can trust in the face of nuclear imperialism is their own nuclear arsenal. Mr. Michel is the author of Foreign Agents: How American Lobbyists and Lawmakers Threaten Democracy Around the World. Still on the opinions page, under Review and Outlook, the Great Entitlement State Grift. The giant Minnesota fraud shows that GOP reformers are right. What happens when welfare becomes not only a temporary hand up, but an ingrained expectation of American life? For an ugly glimpse, look at the astonishing fraud unfolding in Minnesota. Turns out those GOP reformers were right to call out fraud in the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. The White House this week published a memo titled, "Yes, There's Something Wrong with Waltz, and It Cost Taxpayers $1 billion, highlighting the various swindles in the land of 10,000 lakes. There may be as many fraud schemes as lakes in the state, given the ease in which the scammers tapped government funds. Some 86 individuals have been charged with defrauding Medicaid and the federal child nutrition program in Minnesota. Yes, literally stealing lunch money from kids. No one was doing anything about the red flags, one defendant's attorney told the New York Times. It was like someone was stealing money from the cookie jar and they kept refilling it. In one alleged scheme, the outfit Feeding Our Future recruited individuals to set up a network of sham companies and sites that claimed to feed children in the pandemic. The scammers then submitted false invoices and fake attendance rosters to the state. One roster swiped names from a website called www.listoffriendnames.com. After state officials flagged suspect filings, Feeding Our Future cried racial discrimination, and the money kept flowing, according to the federal indictment. Individuals in the network then laundered the money to buy luxury vehicles, residential and commercial real estate in Minnesota, real estate in Kenya and Turkey, and other extravagances. In another scheme, a 28-year-old woman allegedly launched a company, Smart Therapy, that claimed to provide one-on-one behavioral therapy to autistic children. She employed relatives with no formal education and recruited parents to enroll with their non-autistic kids in her therapy sessions by paying them kickbacks of up to $1,500 a month per child. In a darkly comic twist, some parents allegedly extorted the woman by threatening to enroll their children in other autism centers if they weren't paid bigger kickbacks. Smart Therapy allegedly billed Medicaid for the kids' supposed therapy, as well as their transportation to the appointments. It also submitted false claims for meals to the state's food programs. In another indictment, 8 individuals this fall were charged with fraudulently billing Medicaid to help recovering addicts find stable housing. Yes, housing. Minnesota pioneered the use of Medicaid money to help beneficiaries secure housing on the questionable rationale that this would improve their health and reduce health care spending. There's no evidence it's done either. Rather than help shelter recovering addicts, the defendants allegedly laundered millions of Medicaid dollars to enrich themselves. Costs for Minnesota's Medicaid housing program, initially estimated at $2.6 million a year, ballooned to $104 million last year as it became a fund for grifters. We reported on the Biden administration's Medicaid waivers that let states use federal funds to pay for housing, food, transportation, sports fees, and even Native American herbal remedies and exorcisms. The Biden team wanted to give states more federal dollars to spend on social services without having Congress appropriate the money. Medicaid spending runs on autopilot, like Medicare and Social Security. Most states receive between $1 and $9 federal dollars for every one they spend on the program. This large federal match is a disincentive to police fraud. How much more hasn't been uncovered because nobody looked? Democrats blame the mess in Minnesota on the rush to distribute COVID relief. That's doubtful. Federal and state prosecutors in New York this year have charged dozens of companies for fraudulently billing Medicaid for driving beneficiaries to appointments that never occurred or for inflating mileage of the trips. Mr. Trump is highlighting that the alleged Minnesota scammers are ethnic Somalis. It's true that Minnesota's generous welfare state has become a magnet for Somali immigrants, but the main problem here isn't ethnicity or migration. It's the incentives for indolence and fraud at the heart of the welfare state. All that free money, with few guardrails, is an invitation to theft. The GOP tax bill made modest reforms to reduce fraud, such as requiring states to verify Medicaid eligibility twice a year and putting states on the hook for a share of improper food stamp payments. Democrats opposed both and called them cruel. Democrats won't acknowledge fraud because they want more Americans on the dole. Welfare is central to their political business model. Republicans who make this scandal about immigration are missing the point and missing an opportunity to educate Americans about the entitlement state grift. Another piece in Review and Outlook, Hegseth's order and the Admiral. Admiral Bradley says he received no kill-them-all order over a drug boat. Congress is investigating whether the Trump administration fired on defenseless survivors on a drug boat, and the emerging details suggest this story is less than it initially appeared. But the episode still carries lessons about command accountability and larger questions about the Trump war in the Caribbean. Admiral Frank Mitch Bradley visited Capitol Hill on Thursday to talk about the administration's September 2nd drug boat strike. The Washington Post alleged that Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth had ordered U.S. forces to, quote, kill everybody, end quote, on the boat. That would amount to denying quarter to an enemy, which would deviate from the Pentagon's warfare directives and international legal norms. It's a serious allegation. Admiral Bradley is telling Congress that the boat survivors were attempting to continue their drug run and thus still considered combatants. Representative Jim Himes, ranking Democrat on the House Intelligence Committee, told reporters he was troubled by the briefing he received, but he also said, quote, the Admiral confirmed that there had not been a kill-them-all order and that there was not an order to grant no quarter, end quote. That should end the accusations that what happened amounted to a war crime by Mr. Hegseth. The story looks far more like a senior commander making a difficult but informed choice with the orders, battlefield information, and legal framework he had. It's in America's interest to give commanders latitude and to put mission success ahead of legal certitude, and reserve punishment only for willful offenders. But it's notable that Mr. Hegseth has spent the past few days saying he wasn't in the room when the second strike happened, even as he declares his full and total support for Admiral Bradley. It smacks of an attempt to shift scrutiny to a military officer who can't defend his decisions in public. The message to other officers is that they'll be alone in a foxhole if some mission runs into trouble. The buck for the strike and its consequences rests with Secretary Hegseth and President Trump, and standing by Admiral Bradley means producing a factual record for Congress and the public to inspect. One reason this episode has mushroomed is that the administration isn't explaining the aims of its war in the Caribbean. Americans are open to getting tougher on drug cartels, and the president's powers to conduct foreign policy deserve a wide berth. But the administration will have to start explaining why it is asking men and women like Admiral Bradley to open fire. Turning to the business section, and heard on the street, financial analysis and commentary, the main article is that the FDA turmoil threatens biotech recovery. Unexpected delays, infighting, and a staffing crisis are fueling investor unease. This is by David Weiner. The Trump administration's ambition to unleash biomedical innovation and sharpen America's edge against China is colliding with a far messier reality within the Food and Drug Administration. Investors riding a rare biotech recovery don't need to jump off the train, but they should expect a bumpier ride. A mounting sense of chaos inside the agency, driven by internal policy battles, a worsening staffing crisis, and regulatory U-turns, is undermining confidence and threatening investment. The resignation of top drug regulator Richard Pazdur, whose appointment less than a month ago was meant to steady a critical division, delivered a fresh jolt to investors already on edge. He is the fourth person to lead the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research this year. His rapid departure, wrote Brian Abrahams, an analyst at RBC Capital Markets, is likely to feed perceptions around the internal turmoil at the FDA. Earlier this year, investors panicked at the prospect that vaccine skeptic Robert F. Kennedy Jr. could render the biopharma sector uninvestable as health secretary. Those who held their nerve were rewarded. FDA Commissioner Marty Makary, a former Johns Hopkins surgeon, initially cooled jitters, vowing to support innovation and accelerate approvals for rare disease treatments. The SPDR S&P Biotech ETF bounced back, climbing about 48% over the past 6 months. But in recent months, the agency's stance shifted from the collaborative tone of Trump's first term to one defined by unpredictability, staff turnover, and mounting political intrusion, says Raymond James analyst Chris Meekins. He points out that review centers within the agency lost nearly 20% of their staff, while the number of political appointees swelled to more than 20 from about 5 in Trump's first term, sidelining career experts and muddying decision-making. The effects are already visible. The pace of novel drug approvals is slowing, and companies report contradictory guidance and slower early-stage engagement as review teams scramble to recover vacancies. Meekins warns that these structural strains, combined with the shifting evidentiary standards and political whiplash, risk giving China an edge. The more unpredictable the FDA becomes, the greater the risk to investing in the space, Meekins says. The past few months brought an unusual level of tumult. In early November, George Tidmarsh abruptly resigned as head of the drug division, and accusations that he pursued a revenge campaign against a former colleague. Investors briefly cheered when longtime agency oncology chief Pazdur was brought in to steady the drug division, but that relief evaporated within weeks. Reports soon surfaced that Pazdur and Makary were clashing over the legality of new approval initiatives. That kind of whiplash is even more worrying in the division that oversees vaccines and other advanced biologic treatments. Gene therapies are among biotech's most promising frontiers, but also among its most fragile, requiring vast capital and long timelines before investors see any payoff. The sector began to rebound in recent months, helped by the encouraging data from the developer of a cutting-edge treatment for Huntington's disease. In September, Unicure reported that its experimental therapy, delivered in a one-time injection into the brain, slowed disease progression by 75% over 3 years, compared with external controls. In meetings leading up to the data release, the FDA signaled alignment on using this data to pursue an accelerated approval, Unicure said. But, according to a company release, as it prepared to submit the therapy for approval, the agency abruptly signaled it no longer viewed the evidence as adequate. Chief Executive Matt Kapusta called the reversal a drastic change from the guidance the company was given. The stock fell more than 50% on the news. The FDA is well within its rights to scrutinize data that rely on external controls rather than a traditional placebo group. Those comparisons carry a higher risk of bias. But many in the industry say the rules for rare disease treatments seem to have shifted suddenly under Vinay Prasad, who became head of the Center for Biologics Evaluation and Research in May. Prasad was pushed out this summer, but rehired about 2 weeks later. Known for his tough stance on approvals, supported by what he considers weaker evidence, Prasad brought a more rigid scientific philosophy to a division that had previously leaned toward flexibility in rare disease cases. His tenure stirred controversy in vaccines. An internal memo in which Prasad suggested some children's deaths might be linked to COVID-19 vaccines and urged tighter standards going forward set off a firestorm and triggered a sharp drop in vaccine stops. At the heart of the concerns now is a growing perception that politics and internal skirmishes are eclipsing science. The zigzagging has amplified industry worries about inconsistent signals from the agency. Whether the FDA can calm investor nerves now largely depends on how the administration responds to the latest bout of turmoil. Last month, the Wall Street Journal reported that senior Trump administration officials, including RFK Jr., discussed curbing Makary's role amid friction between his deputies. The biotech industry has begun to recover after years of trouble, but investors know it can't prosper over the long term without a steady FDA hand. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the Wall Street Journal on the Niagara Frontier radio reading service. Another herd on the street, we might really need a rate cut. Stock investors' attitudes toward interest rate cuts has long been that too much of a good thing can be wonderful. Next week's widely expected one by a divided Federal Reserve is seen as just-in-case move that has buoyed valuations in a strong economy. The S&P 500 itself is many people's barometer of confidence. What if the economy urgently needs the boost? With missing or delayed data because of government shutdown, forecasters have had to lean more heavily on private sector surveys and indexes. One of those, Wednesday's employment report from payroll processor ADP, was disappointing It estimated that private sector jobs dropped by 32,000 in November instead of an expected rise of 40,000, the worst month since 2023. Earlier this week, a closely watched survey of manufacturers by the Institute for Supply Management was weak, too. Its new orders index, a forward-looking measure, has now contracted in 9 of the last 10 months. One of the few bright spots was prices paid, which is a worrying hint about inflationary pressures. It is helpful to contrast the mostly fine current indicators such as income and unemployment with forward-looking measures like factory orders. The absolute level of an index can become unmoored over the years, but comparing two from the same era shouldn't. One of the most reliable ratios out there, itself delayed by the shutdown, was flashing red by August. This compares the Conference Board's leading economic index to the board's coincident economic index. In a nutshell, these indicators measure how things might look in the future and how things were at that time, respectively. The LEI to CEI ratio dipped below 1 just before the last two sharp recessions, in late 2000 and late 2007. The latest readings, which were for August, formed one of the lowest ratios ever. Going back to the 1980s, the only 3 times it was lower was at the bottom of the financial crisis bear market, February through April 2009. There were just 2 areas of strength in the latest LEI: stock prices and the leading credit index. That might be because those markets are wise and all-seeing, or maybe it's excessive investor optimism over artificial intelligence and rate cuts. Regardless, the LEI-CEI ratio might have been at a record low without that cheer. Turning to real numbers, investors are reassured that earning per share growth for the third quarter is averaging a rosy 13.4%, with nearly all reports in, according to FactSet. Should they be? Earnings growth in the third quarter of 2000 and the second quarter of 2007 looked even better. Expected Fed easing at both times seemed like insurance cuts, but both stocks and the economy were just starting a rough patch. That was by Spencer Jacob. Appliance company to sell majority stake in Viking stove unit by Miriam Gottfried and Lauren Thompson. Billionaire investor Josh Harris's firm, 26 North Partners, struck a deal to take a controlling stake in Middleby's kitchen products division. 26 North is set to own 51% of the unit that houses a number of luxury cookware equipment brands, including the Viking, Lynx, La Cornue, Rangemaster, and AGA. Middleby is set to own the remainder. The deal, unveiled Thursday after the Wall Street Journal earlier reported on it, values the unit at $885 million, Middleby chief executive Tim Fitzgerald said in an interview. Middleby, which has a market value of around $6 billion, designs and manufactures cooking equipment used in commercial, residential, and industrial settings. Harris, a co-founder of Apollo Global Management, launched 26 North in 2022. 26 North has roughly $32 billion in assets under management and focuses on private equity, credit, and insurance. Harris is also a co-owner of professional sports teams, including the Philadelphia 76ers and the Washington Commanders. Middleby shares were down more than 11% year to date through Wednesday, in part because lower foot traffic and higher food costs have hurt the restaurant industry. They closed up 5% Thursday after the deal was announced. The company faced additional pressure from activist investor Ed Garden, who earlier this year landed a seat on Middleby's board. Garden, a co-founder of activist hedge fund Trian Fund Management, who has since launched his own firm, had argued Middleby was lagging behind peers. In February, Middleby said it would spin out its food processing business to focus on commercial food services. Its commercial food service platform delivered about $2.4 billion in revenue last year. Fitzgerald said he sees a recovery happening across the restaurant industry and in residential, which had stalled as the housing market slowed. 26 North, meanwhile, has been looking to put more money to work through private equity deals. The Middleby transaction will mark its 6th such deal in roughly a year. Mark Weinberg, who leads 26 North's private equity arm, said in an interview. The firm struck its debut private equity deal in September 2024 when it agreed to buy Arch Key Solutions, a provider of electrical, technological, and specialty systems. A month later, it announced a deal for the gym chain One Life Fitness. The Financial Times reported in October that 26 North was in talks to take control of the kitchen products division. In Corporate Watch, Kroger. Grocery swings to quarterly loss. Kroger swung to a fiscal third quarter loss as expenses rose, though it said it is making progress on its strategic priorities by improving the customer experience and building a foundation for long-term growth. The supermarket chain on Thursday posted a loss of $1.32 billion, or $2.02 a share. That compares with a profit of $618 million, or 85 cents a share a year earlier. Stripping out one-time costs, Kroger notched earnings of $1.05 a share. Analysts surveyed by FactSet expected adjusted earnings of $1.03 a share. Sales edged 0.7% higher to $33.86 billion, missing the $34.19 billion that Wall Street modeled. Identical sales, or those from stores and digital channels open for at least a year, rose 2.6%, excluding volatile fuel sales. Analysts had expected a 2.9% gain. The company raised the low end of its earnings outlook to $4.75 a share from $4.70 a share, while maintaining the high end at $4.80 a share, by Connor Hart. Hormel Foods. The firm is hopeful after profit is hit by costs. Hormel Foods is hoping the steps it took to improve profitability will start yielding results after what interim chief executive Jeff Ettinger said was a disappointing earnings performance in 2025. We fell significantly short of our earnings goal in navigating a dynamic consumer environment, elevated input costs, and some unexpected setbacks, he said on a call with analysts Thursday. Hormel said higher input costs weighed on profit as commodity prices across several brands and categories rose. At the same time, the industry didn't grow as expected. Hormel sought to offset the challenges with targeted pricing acts and updates to its distribution network. The company cut about 250 corporate and sales positions, or roughly 9% of the group, in a push to lower administrative expenses, Ettinger said. Hormel guided for fiscal 2026 adjusted earnings of $1.43 to $1.51 a share on sales of $12.2 billion to $12.5 billion. Analysts surveyed by FactSet were looking for adjusted earnings of $1.45 a share on sales of $12.43 billion. For its quarter ended October 26th, Hormel swung to a loss of $56.1 million, or 10 cents a share, from a profit of $220.2 million, or 40 cents a share, a year earlier. The recent quarter included a roughly $234 million non-cash impairment charge, which it said was primarily related to a minority investment in its international unit and certain intangible assets in its retail segment. Sales rose 1.5%. to $3.19 billion, below the $3.22 billion that Wall Street had modeled. And that's by Connor Hart. You've been listening to a reading of articles and features from the Friday, December 5th issue of the Wall Street Journal. We read from this Wall Street Journal every Monday through Thursday at 11 p.m. Your reader has been Dasha. Thank you for listening.
Coming up next in the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service, we have a reading of the Buffalo Criterion, followed at 8 o'clock by the New York Times, and at 9 o'clock by Buffalo Spree. Stay with us for these readings and more throughout the day. following program is intended for listeners who are blind, have low vision, or have another